Hi everyone, this is Nia, and today I'm going to be doing a sketchbook tour. I've been getting a lot of requests for this lately, so I'm just going to put everything together. This one is not as elaborate as the previous one since it hasn't been that long, and you guys know how I like to skip through sketchbooks. And the open sketchbook on the right is just a continuation from the previous sketchbook tour. I'm going to start with these two sketchbooks. As you guys know, this is the sketchbook that I use for the first stage of planning, for quick studies, pencil sketches, thumbnail layout, and minimal painting. I also use this to teach sometimes and sketch things outside of YouTube as well. So I'm going to begin with this one, which is a continuation of the previous sketchbook tour. So you'll probably notice that the sketch on the left is the first sketch that I made before my vase painting. The one at the top is from my wisteria, and the one at the bottom is something that I never got to do because it turned out being harder than I thought. And this donut is the early stages of planning before I turned it into a Skillshare class. A lot of times when I do try things out on my sketchbook, I don't necessarily make tutorials straight away. Sometimes I do practice, or sometimes I try to figure out if I would be able to make it or edit it within a 20-minute mark or a bit more than a 20-minute mark, because any more than that I wouldn't be able to fit it into my schedule. And sometimes I also like to do trials for shapes and things like that. And this page is actually a good example of it, where someone asked me continuously to do a succulent tutorial, but I found out that it was really difficult to break it down into a simple tutorial. Maybe one day I'll be able to figure out how to do it, maybe by separating it into two tutorials or something like that, but it's something that I decided to leave for now. This is also from one of my old doodles. I tend to jump a lot from page to page, so there will be a lot of old mixed with the new, even in my other sketchbooks, because I just tend to open up a page and draw and paint wherever I feel like the space is somewhat sufficient for the time being. And as for the last page of this sketchbook, this is where I use it to study a little bit of perspective for my underwater painting tutorial. I think I ended up filming this one 3 times. The first one I made the wrong step when I was filming, second time the steps weren't clear enough, and the third was finally something that I thought was clear enough to follow. But anyway, this is the end of what's left of this sketchbook, so let's move on to the newer sketchbook, where I've only finished halfway through because halfway I kind of abandoned this sketchbook for a cheaper notebook, which also has a lot of even worse and messy sketches and trials, along with loads of personal notes, so I'm not really able to show you guys this notebook slash sketchbook, but hopefully I can get back to the sketchbook again and make a compilation of my messy planning process. So this is basically the same brand of sketchbook, and it has the same usage. I like to doodle and plan things with this sketchbook, but I also draw things outside of YouTube as well. Here on the bottom left is where I sketched out layouts for my friend who was having trouble with her bullet journal because it was her first time. And here on the right are ideation for YouTube tutorials, and I even plan out my thumbnail sketches as well. And here's an example of a painting that I did with oil pastel for one of my private students' lessons. On the left here, this is where I sketched out ideation for one of my Skillshare classes. I really wanted to paint ice cream, but I wasn't sure what type of ice creams, so I just jot down ideas really quickly, and here are the ice creams that I ended up painting. The one on the right is my first try. I wanted to try something that's a bit more loose, but it ended up being messy and I didn't really like the style, and I thought that the strawberry was a bit too much, so I simplified it to this one, which ended up being my final painting for my Skillshare class. The one in the middle here is also another thumbnail sketch for one of my Skillshare classes where I painted crepes. This was one of my favorites to paint because it has so many different textures and really bright colors. Moving along, here's a page that I used to plan out one of my YouTube tutorials where I painted butterfly bookmarks. On the left is a cleaner version of the crepes that I painted for Skillshare, and on the right is the sketches that I made for the tutorial itself. So this spread is probably one of my favorites from the sketchbook. It's a page where I try to teach my student to hold her pencil a bit more loose so she can create different textures and pressures using different grips. It's not a really go-to style for me, but I enjoy the times where I actually get to do these types of loose sketches. Here are more thumbnail sketches that I did to get ideas out of my head and try out different subject matters and compositions. I also draw them according to different sizes of the sketchbooks that I use, so I have a better visualization of how it will be roughly framed. On the left is a self-portrait that I made of myself in a chibi version with my husky, and here are just more sketches that I made for my YouTube tutorials. If you guys are wondering what those things are on the right page, they're called martabak, which is an Indonesian dessert, and at the bottom is kue lapis, which is basically like layered cake. I've been wanting to paint Indonesian food for a while, but I haven't had the chance to paint for myself these days, so I just kept the ideas in the sketchbook. This is probably one of my most embarrassing page of a stunted flat cat. I had so many requests to paint a cat, which is not a subject matter I can paint, and this was the trials I made. And on the right is a painting I made with my student. She found a picture on Pinterest that she liked of a black cat, and she wanted to recreate it, and that's just basically my version of it. The one on the left is another one from my lesson. My student wanted to draw this character, and on the right was just a really quick sketch of my Sakurako box that I got. Here's just a sketch of a wedding dress that I thought of. I thought I was going to get my wedding dress custom made, but I changed my mind. And at the back are ideations for my wedding invitations, along with other YouTube trial sketches. So yeah, I pretty much used this sketchbook for ideation dumping ground. This is quite a random sketch. So close to my wedding day, like 2 days before, we realized that we needed table numbers for the sitting plan that we wanted to do. So this was just a last minute quick sketch design, and on the right are more YouTube ideation for bookmarks and tags that I was thinking of for Christmas last year, along with some ideations that I made for December content. So this is the last page that I've done so far on this sketchbook, which is for the Christmas gift tags that I painted last December. Moving along, this is the sketchbook for my next process. This is my watercolor sketchbook where I do trial paintings or smaller versions and test for textures or color combinations, among other things. I'm never really too strict with the system that I've created because I don't really want it to become a burden, but something that is going to help me instead. And because this paper has actual watercolor paper instead of the sketch paper from the previous sketchbook, I think it has a better representation of how the colors or how the paint should react with each other. Just like my previous sketchbook, not everything that I try out in this watercolor sketchbook is something that I would definitely make a tutorial out of. Instead, this is where I experiment but with paint. So if I'm curious about certain techniques or how I'd create textures or even painting steps and color combinations, I just try it out here without any pressure. Again, there are many mistakes and embarrassing trials and errors here, but I think that's the point of learning. And since I make my own sketchbooks and I didn't spend too much money on it, I feel like it lessens the burden of making mistakes, and I don't really feel like I'm wasting it when there's actually no problem with making mistakes in the first place, because that's actually a huge part of learning. But I know that a lot of you have the same feeling as well, and this is why I always recommend or advocate for learners to use supplies within their budget instead of splurging too much on something that you'd be too scared or intimidated to use in the end. So here's an example where I played with different color combinations. They're similar colors here, but I tried different brands as well as seeing a simpler version or more colors within that small area, and to see just which one fits most with the painting. And I also like to take into consideration the ease of it as well, especially when I'm making simpler tutorials. Here I also tried learning how to paint little chicks. I mean, the idea of it was simple, but learning the anatomy ended up being quite difficult for me, so I just let that idea go for now, but who knows, maybe in the future I'll get back to it again. And this is something that I tend to do as well. If a subject matter is too difficult and I don't end up painting it in the end, a lot of times I like to go back to it again, even if it's years after. Just like my other sketchbook, you can see me jump around with my sketches. So you can see my old vase sketches here, as well as my Cosmo flowers at the bottom. And on the right is a trial that I made for my Skillshare class. And this is one of my favorite ones that I've done so far. This one on the left might look familiar. This is a trial that I made before painting the flower field. I remember I was pretty new with painting sceneries and landscapes with watercolors when I made this, which is why I make full trials like this. But these days I try to do thumbnail trials so I don't take too long in the planning stages. This is another trial that I made for one of my sceneries. This is my sunset beach, but I used gouache instead for this trial. I originally wanted to paint this with gouache, but as I was painting this isn't finished by the way, I just didn't like how the paint felt, and it just felt really slow. Even though I think the colors would look nice with gouache, I just ended up using watercolors again. This is the second stage of my crepe painting and my ice cream painting that I showed you guys earlier from the previous sketchbook. And this is where I picked colors and also tried different variations and textures. And I also tried to figure out how to break down the process before I turn it into a class. I also swatch with this sketchbook. As you guys know, I also have a video on this. This is where I swatch the colors that my friend gave me. And it's always nice to have reference to the colors that you have. And it just makes it so much easier when you're trying to pick out colors for certain paintings. This is one of my embarrassing pages, but this is the first stage of the beach painting that I made a while back. This is, of course, one of my earlier scenery or landscape paintings as well, which is why I made a huge page for a trial. And I also tried to paint rainbows, which I thought kind of ended up ruining the actual composition itself. So I kind of scrapped that idea, even though I tried it out the second time also in another sketchbook. For looser paintings and doodles, I tend to spend more time picking out color combinations because the painting itself is not too difficult since I do pen doodles underneath. But I really love doing this and I think I learned a lot from it too. Here's another quick ugly version of a scenery painting, and on the right are my doodles and trials for my budgie painting. I also found out that I used a few damaged paper when I made the sketchbook without realizing it, so sometimes the color just gets absorbed really quickly and it's really obvious in this painting right here, especially when I'm using a lot of water and paint in a very large area, but that's okay. It's a little bit annoying when I'm in the middle of painting, but they're only trials anyway, so it doesn't really bother me too much. Here's another page that I've dedicated to try out and swatch different colors and color combinations, and for this one I wanted to be autumn themed, so those are the colors that I picked. Here are some sketches that I was planning to make a Skillshare class out of, but I'm still unsure about it, so I was just trying out different ideas. And as you can see, I'm not really strict with how I use my books. Obviously it was supposed to be put on the other sketchbook, but if I just happened to hold this one and I felt like doodling something with pencil, it also doesn't matter too much. As you can see from here, I was getting a bit more comfortable with painting sceneries. So instead of doing the larger trials, these small thumbnail paintings are sufficient for me as long as I can figure out the color combinations and such. For the one on the left, I didn't even end up painting the whole thing. I just made a few elements and put it all together and make sure that the colors work. And for the eggs, I just tried 2 different techniques of painting them and see which one kind of looked the best. And that's pretty much it. The next page of the sketchbook will be my last page, and I'm really running out of space to do my trials these days, so I really need to make a new one. Moving on, this is the only sketchbook with my finished paintings that I've completed so far, and there are lots of paintings that you guys are probably familiar with, so I'm not going to talk too much about this one, but I also made a lot of mistakes here, and sometimes I refilm things again, so you'll see quite a few repetitions for certain subject matters. I made this doodle a while back and I wasn't sure if it was interesting enough as a subject matter, so I ended up just scrapping all the footage, but I don't know if you guys are interested. Maybe I'll reconsider making it again. I hated this incident. So basically I finished the whole painting and I finished filming, but when I was peeling my masking tape, this happened. I was so annoyed, so I ended up refilming it, but I don't think this is a luxury that I have these days, so I hope it doesn't happen again. This is the second try that I mentioned earlier with the rainbow. I did paint it properly this time, but I still didn't like how the rainbow looked. I felt like it took away from the final composition, so I ended up taking it off for the actual tutorial. Sometimes I also can't be bothered to get my other sketchbook out, so I also do some scrap paintings here and some trials and planning, but I try to not do it too often in this sketchbook. sometimes I also make mistakes. So when I was trying to do the 4 doodles here, it ended up being a bit too blocky and I wanted to create a bit of space in between all those squares. So yeah, I just ended up scrapping that whole page. So this is basically the last painting of the sketchbook and the sketchbook tour. I hope you guys enjoyed this one as much as the previous one. Like usual, all my social media links will be listed in my description box. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching till the end, and I'll see you at the next one. Bye!